dioxide is accumulating in the atmosphere. Half of it is being trapped on the Earth, the oceans. The other half is accumulating. Sea levels are rising. Forest fires are increasing. Floods are sweeping across Europe. Hurricanes are increasing. Worsening landslides. More inland floods. The Great Barrier Reef is dying. Plastic straws are being stuck up noses of the turtles. Everybody's dying. But the good news is we don't need fossil fuels or nuclear. We can rely solely on wind and solar panels, and we can just stop eating meat. There's a bit more to the story than that, isn't there? These are things that you're never going to read in the New York Times or the Washington Post. Carbon emissions actually slightly declined over the last decade. In Britain, they've been declining for almost 50 years. Same thing in France. In the United States, carbon emissions have declined 22% between 2005 and 2020. 60% of those reductions are thanks to fracking for natural gas. We reduced our carbon emissions more than any other country in the world, and we did so without cap and trade, without any climate policy. In fact, Obama's proposed cap and trade agenda would have reduced carbon emissions 17%. We reduced them 22% thanks to old-fashioned American ingenuity. What about natural disasters? Hardly anybody dies of them. Each year, a couple hundred Americans, 200 to 400 people every year, a decline of over 95% worldwide, even as the population quadrupled. No increase in hurricane frequency globally. Landfalling hurricanes are flat. No increase in the cost of hurricanes once you account for more wealth in harm's way. So yes, when a hurricane hits Miami Beach, it causes more damage than it did 100 years ago, but that's because there's more wealth on Miami Beach. In fact, the cost of natural disasters, because our infrastructure is so well developed, so resilient, has actually been going down for the last 30 years. As for those landslides, this famous study from Columbia showed that they're occurring in places where there's high levels of corruption and they're not enforcing good building codes. I live on one of the steepest hillsides in Berkeley, California, and because we have good flood management, the water moves around our house. So the malign vector of disinformation is Greta Thunberg. Whenever she tweets pictures of flooding in India or in Africa, she's deliberately misleading her followers into thinking that it's a result of climate change when we know it's a result of poverty. As for hurricanes, the two main scientific bodies that make predictions say that we may see a 5% increase in hurricane frequency, but we will likely see a 25% decline in frequency and a very modest increase of intensity. What about these two pieces of malign disinformation? What did they do? They did the same thing that you learn in your college statistics class, which is not to make an error in reporting. You might get an increase of reports, but that doesn't mean that there's been an increase in the thing itself. This is the same manipulative technique that people use to suggest an increase in police brutality, in anti-Semitism and racism. You're measuring an increase of reporting because we get better at reporting over time. On the right, you can see what Financial Times did is they simply didn't correct for the reporting error, and on the left, they simply cherry-picked the period after 1980. If you do a full century, there's no increase in hurricanes. No trend of US heat wave frequency or magnitude. This is taken directly from the US government's Fourth National Climate Assessment. The 30s were really hot, it turned out. Like because I became obsessed with this issue, I read every New York Times story about heat waves for the last 150 years. And in the 1930s, like people are dying in the street, dying in these apartment buildings, they're being, taken to the hospital. And the media coverage, in the middle of the Great Depression, the media coverage of the New York Times was like, I don't know why so many people are dying. I mean, things have been pretty good around here. It was the most blasé attitude in the news media towards all of these heat wave deaths. Meanwhile, when you have a tiny number of heat wave deaths a couple of years ago, it's the world is coming to an end. And so yes, something in the environment has changed, but it's the mental environment of the people who write for the New York Times, not what's happening in the world. We see declining deaths from heat waves, just a simple technological fix. Can anybody guess why fewer people die in heat waves? Just shout it out. You all are well educated. No increase in droughts in Europe, declining deaths from flooding in Europe. One of the best things about social media is that when I started writing about this issue a few years ago, people would tweet the photos from their little villages in Europe where they would have these lines on the buildings, on the sides of the buildings. Have you guys ever seen these? And it'd be like, 1560, the flood reached here. 1780, reached here. So we know that that's not true. There is a greater area flooded in many cities around the world, but you see the deaths from flooding is going down everywhere. China, Pakistan, which is one of the places that Greta Thunberg has deliberately misled people. The result of declining deaths from extreme weather events and declining cost of extreme weather events means that the number of extreme weather events that are considered to be a disaster by the only center in the world that properly studies disasters, the only database for natural disasters, the MDAT data center in Belgium, shows a declining number of disasters. So disasters are actually going down because we're becoming so resilient. What explains why more area in cities is flooding is simply because the cities are expanding, and as they are near rivers, more area might be flooded, but you're also managing that flooding better. What about sea level rise? It is happening, but I'm not that worried about it, in part because I've been to the Netherlands, and a third of the Netherlands is below sea level. Some parts of it 7 meters below sea level. We know how to manage water. The idea that some more precipitation because of climate change is the apocalypse is the most ridiculous conspiracy theory of the many conspiracy theories we've been told. Fires have declined globally by 25%. That's an area about the size of Texas. My biggest concern about the disinformation about fire is that people they're training children to think that fire is bad. Most forests need fire. This is basic forest ecology. When the Europeans came to California, they were shocked that the forests were so smoky, that California was so smoky because there was all of these, what we call low-intensity fires burning the woody debris. President Trump wasn't wrong when he said that you just need to rake the forests. They use slightly better, more sophisticated machines than rakes to do that, but forest management determines whether you have high-intensity fires or low-intensity fires. And this was dramatically proven in 2020 when a high-intensity fire in a badly managed public forest arrived at a well-managed private forest, and the high-intensity fire dropped to the ground and became a low-intensity fire. So we're not doomed to lose our montane or mountain forests because of climate change. We just need to manage our forests better. What about the Great Barrier Reef? Turns out that it has record high levels of coral. Ostensibly the highest in 36 years, but we don't know because we've only been measuring it for 36 years. So the death of the Great Barrier Reef was vastly overstated. Peter Ridd, one of the few honest Australian ecologists, was censored by Facebook for accurately reporting record high coral growth in 2021. By 2022, after 2 years of record high coral growth, Facebook finally ended its censorship, at least their publicly acknowledged censorship of Peter Ridd. Recycling plastic is the reason for the plastic waste crisis. 90% of the plastic that you put into your recycling bin does not get recycled. It goes to poor countries where they don't have proper waste management systems. It ends up in the rivers, it ends up in the oceans. Please don't recycle your plastic because it's not being recycled. Just throw it in the trash so it can go to the incinerator or the landfill. As for vegetarianism, I speak from personal experience. It's a difficult eating disorder to maintain. I'm just joking. One of my best friends is a vegetarian. He's not here though. Most people abandon it after a year, and it's not necessary to saving the natural environment. So How did I come to these conclusions? I spent a lot of time in poor countries. I've seen what it's like when you have to haul your own wood and water. It's a form of oppression for children when you have to spend your day gathering wood and gathering water. There's some beauty to it, but it's a very difficult life. And around the world, there's still 2.5 billion people that rely on solid fuels for their heat and for their cooking. Nobody needs to use solid fuels anymore. We're actually able to completely end our reliance on solid fuels, whether it's wood or dung or coal. We can use things like oil and gas and nuclear as our primary sources of energy. This is my book. How do we want to think about energy and progress? The first thing is we produce abundant amounts of food. There's no risk of running out of food, at least for any physical reasons. We are growing more food on less land. That's the key to creating more habitat for endangered species. The less productive farmlands become grasslands and forests and habitat. What about climate change? Massively outweighed by fertilizer, tractors, and roads, and irrigation. And you can see here it's a little complicated chart, but basically this proves if you have more technological advancements, again, mostly fertilizer, irrigation, and tractors, the little black dots show you'll massively increase production.